Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics for the 2024 Post-Election Conference. My name is Anna Sophia, and I'm the president of the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board, the official student group of the Institute. As a graduating senior this month studying political science and international studies, I could not be more grateful to the Dole Institute and SAB for pushing me to seek out opportunities in government and set myself up post-graduation. The Student Advisory Board is a bipartisan group whose members can access many great opportunities through their involvement with the Institute, including volunteering at programs and networking with our special guests. If you are a student and would like to join, please email us at dolesab@kau.edu or speak with a student worker after the program. A video of today's program will be available on our YouTube channel, where you can also access videos of past programs. In addition, a loop hearing system is available if you have a T-coil hearing aid. We also have a limited number of hearing devices. If you have questions about the loop or system, or if at any time during the program you have difficulty hearing, please alert one of our staff members. We will have 2 sessions today. The first session will conclude at 3:45 p.m., and there will be a 15-minute break. After the end of the second session, we will answer a limited number of questions submitted by email, and you can also write your questions at the back table over here, where a student worker can record your questions that we can later answer. You may submit these questions by email at dolequestions@ku.edu. The Dole Institute's mission is to foster civil and respectful discussion around important and often difficult topics. Please phrase your questions with this in mind. Finally, before we begin, I'd like to remind you to turn off your cell phones. Now, please join me in welcoming Director of the Institute, Audrey Coleman.
Welcome to the Dole Institute. This is such an exciting afternoon for us. We're so glad you could gather with us for the 2024 National Panel of our Post-Election Conference. I see many of you in the audience are longtime fans of the Dole Institute, and so you probably remember that the very first post-election program that we held was in 2004, and that was hosted by, of course, my predecessor, Bill Lacy, who we're so pleased is with us for the last time as a moderator of this afternoon. So we've covered, I'm going to go through the numbers here. Presidential elections, general elections, 2004, 2008, 2012, 2016, 2020, virtually, and now here we are in 2024, and also in the intervening years with the midterm elections. This year, the 2024 cycle was set up to be somewhat of a rerun, but it ended up anything but predictable, and we're so honored that Bill is back here, well seasoned as he is, to lead us through this afternoon's conversations and the inflection points in this year's race. Equally exciting and something that we also look forward to, I know all of us here in the audience in the Dole Institute community, is welcoming back our friend and visiting fellow Jerry Seib, of course formerly of the Wall Street Journal and columnist of the Capital Journal that he wrote for over 30 years, to co-moderate the discussion this afternoon with our nationally recognized panelists this year. Thank you both to Bill and Jerry for building this outstanding slate and designing this discussion. I want to thank the team at the Dole Institute for all their work, the staff and students who put so much into producing our sessions this afternoon. And again, thank you all to you all in the audience for joining us. Reviewing a couple of details, as Anna Sophia said, we'll break at 3:45 for a 15-minute break and reconvene at 4 o'clock. She mentioned questions. We're doing that a little bit different due to the time constraint. You can email dolequestions@ku.edu during this first part of the session. And also, as she mentioned, you can go to the back table and write those out on paper. We'll get to what we can. We've got a lot of ground to cover in a very short amount of time. Lastly, thank you to all of you friends of the Dole Institute. I see many of you here. Thank you to our board members, our student advisory board members, and all of us folks as part of the Dole Institute community who support our vision of political discussion that connects across difference, that fosters mutual understanding, and offers a shared path forward. So it's really a pleasure to be here with all of you today. Please join me in a warm round of appreciation for all of our national panelists, many of whom traveled a significant distance and are spending the time with us this afternoon. So let's give them a warm round of applause before we get started. Way to get that in.
He's in the spirit.
Very good. One more thing, if you're not on our digital email newsletter subscription, you can sign up on our website at doleinstitute.org. We have a fabulous slate coming up in the spring. You won't want to miss any of those announcements. And that's my final message. So with great pleasure, I will turn it over to Bill Lacy to make further introductions and get our conversation started this afternoon. Thank you so much, Bill.
Okay, thank you, Audrey. Thanks for the reference to me being well-seasoned. I think that means I'm old.
Like a fine wine.
Okay, thank you. That was a very nice recovery. We have an extraordinary group of panelists with us today. And if you want to see their detailed bios, I understand there is a code on your programs. You can go to our website and look at their bios. But I'm going to do very brief introductions, and we'll start with my co-moderator, Jerry Seib of the Wall Street Journal, visiting fellow at the Dole Institute. Next, to his left, is Chuck Todd, who's the chief political analyst for NBC News and former host of Meet the Press. Francesca Chambers is next. Francesca is a White House correspondent for USA Today and is a former Dole Institute Student Advisory Board member. Brendan Buck, who joined us 2 years ago as a top Republican communications strategist who served 2 Republican speakers. Molly Murphy is a leading Democratic pollster and advisor to Vice President Harris's campaign. Alex Latchman worked for President Trump since 2016, including a 4-year stint in the White House political office and most recently as the Director of Congressional Engagement for the Trump campaign. Anita Dunn is a partner of the public affairs firm SKDK and a senior advisor to President Joe Biden. Molly Ball is the Wall Street Journal's senior political correspondent. And joining us for the second session will be Jonathan Martin, the Politics Bureau Chief and Senior Political Columnist at Politico. So we'll get started, and Anita, I'll start with you, and this is not a particularly easy question, but it's one that we have to ask. The president was going to be a bridge to the next generation of Democratic leadership at one point. Was there any discussion about his not seeking re-election, particularly in light of his apparent age-related challenges?
Well, Bill, thank you for the softball. Appreciate it. I want to thank the Dole Institute for having us here today. I want to thank Bill and Jerry and Audrey, but I also just find this building and the exhibits here are extraordinary. So I just want to thank you for the opportunity to come here. And I also Bill's small, gentle thing, but I'm no longer a partner at that firm. I had to leave it when I went into the White House. So anyway, so let's go back and level set here, which is an extraordinarily successful first 2 years of President Biden's term, historically successful, in which he and the narrowest of margins in Congress managed to pass historic infrastructure, historic investment in our chips industry and manufacturing reshoring back in this country. A Recovery Act that was instrumental in so many communities, not going bottom up, and also in us dealing with the COVID pandemic. Investments in clean energy manufacturing that created jobs throughout this country, primarily in states that are not Democratic, and also, for the first time historically, giving pharmaceutical companies, holding them accountable and letting the federal government, in particular Medicare, actually negotiate lower prices, which is not only going to be a boon to Medicare recipients, but also to that federal deficit that I think many of us are concerned about. So a historic, and that obviously there are a whole bunch of things that I know people in the White House are saying, she didn't mention the PACT Act. There are a bunch of things we got done. So then we have a midterm election. And the midterm election is one where it's a referendum very much on both the economy, and of course we'd had inflation coming out of COVID, and a country that was extremely unhappy about the economy. For cause, prices had gone up. We still had supply chain problems. Gas prices went up after the war in Ukraine began. So people were upset, and they had reason to be upset. But other issues in that midterm, the Supreme Court's decision, of course, to get rid of Roe v. Wade in June of 2022, and states immediately beginning to put some extraordinary restrictions on women's ability to make decisions about their own health, and also the democracy issue coming out of 2020, January 6th, and concerns around that. So you had three big issues. And, according to most prognosticators, and certainly according to history, that should have been a disastrous midterm for the Democratic Party. It should have been. I was there, by the way, when Barack Obama got, quote, shellacked in 2010. We lost 63 House seats, 63. I was around in 1994 when Bill Clinton's first midterm resulted in the Democrats losing the House for the first time in 40 years, and obviously significant numbers of Senate seats in both those elections as well. In 2022, the Democratic Party picked up a Senate seat, and only lost 9 House seats, which historically was a pretty extraordinary performance. The president came out of that midterm feeling as though he'd had a very, very successful 2 years, that to some extent that 2 years had been validated by voters across the country, and obviously we'd been successful gubernatorial races as well. And he felt very strongly that there were things he still wanted to do as president. So the decision to run, Bill, was very much, I think, one that both the politics and also the policy were dictating to him. Presidents and people who run for president make that decision because they think they're the best person for that job, and they can ask advice, and staff is going to give them their best unvarnished, honest assessment of what's going to happen in terms of the campaign. But presidents and presidential candidates make that decision because they think they are the best person to go lead this country. And that's what he did.
So let's pick up there because, Anita, there was the early fateful decision, obviously, to run, but there was another early and, in retrospect, fateful decision, which was to have an exceptionally early initial debate. Mm-hmm. Why the decision to do that? And I guess, Alex, from your point of view, why did the Trump campaign agree to a debate that early? Because it wasn't clear at the outset that the former president would agree to do that. But you first, Anita.
Great, and then I'll let Alex say that actually they were out there challenging us to debate all the time. So we wanted a debate, The president had done very well in 2020 in both the debates against Trump. We were in a situation where the race was still very much a referendum on the president as opposed to being portrayed as a choice. We were anxious to start having voters start to look at a choice again, to look at the two of them, as opposed to everything I don't like about Joe Biden, that they needed to be reminded there were certainly a lot of things they hadn't liked about Donald Trump either, and actually still didn't like. So we also were looking at a couple of other things that were very real. One of them was we needed moments to really galvanize our voters. We needed to build moments, particularly for our small donor fundraising. Debates were huge for that. We didn't want to do debates within the Commission on Presidential Debates. The Republican Party had already said they were not going to do it. Their schedule was very late. It was after people had already started voting, and was driven by a lot of considerations that actually didn't lead to the best debates. We thought 2020, that model, the two of them in a studio, had worked very well for the American people. And we thought that it made a lot of sense to try to do one before we went into the summer. They had a July convention, we had an August convention. We thought do one before the convention, one early September, around the time early vote begins, call it a day. So we also felt that voters, because of the president's age, would expect to see him debate, that was something they needed to see him do. And and former President Trump was challenging us to debate, so we thought, okay, let's do them.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of our side, at the end of the day, President Trump drove that desire to debate. He wanted to show the contrast between President Biden himself, what he was going to deliver for the American people, the contrasted messaging on crime and the border, immigration, the economy. And so he was really the driving force. At the end of the day, it was the staff that was executing, and Chris and Susie leading the campaign, negotiating those dates.
Okay, after the president made his decision to withdraw, and I'd like everybody to feel free to jump in on this one because I'm not directing it at any particular person, but after the president made his decision not to run for re-election, would the Democrats have benefited from a contest for the nomination, or was that not feasible?
I don't think that the Democrats would have benefited from a contest at that late stage in the cycle. I think that already with 107 days and there being, sort of the other piece outside of just the calendar and how limited that window is Democratic base voters were incredibly deflated. And what we needed to do was consolidate Democrats to get this race competitive again. I think that primaries in a long arc of a 2-year or longer election cycle can be very unifying. It can bring out spirited debate. It can identify important issues and priorities. It can stress test your candidates. But on such a narrow and concise window, I think it would have been a bloodbath that would have left a lot of Democratic voters feeling even more dispirited regardless of who emerged from it. Organizationally, in terms of the calendar, I think it also would have been really difficult then for whoever emerged to have the infrastructure. There are a lot of things that regular people don't take into consideration about use of funds and who is going to fund what programs, field operations, how best, that just takes time. It's not a sexy conversation. It's not an especially interesting one, but those also can add time and resource deficiencies, which was already an issue. If you remember at this time, right around this time, I think it was when Elon Musk said he was going to dump some enormous sum every day into the race. So resource consolidation was also an important part. So perhaps if the window was longer, there are all kinds of incredible what ifs about, what would have happened if there was a primary, but based on the time and when this happened and the state of sort of Democratic voters feeling disengaged, deflated in the money race, it would have been awful.
If I could just jump in here to kind of backtrack in time, though, this goes back to your original question, though, about President Biden deciding to run for re-election. He had said he was going to be a bridge and a transitional president, and the Democratic voters that I were talking to around that point in time felt frustrated that there hadn't been a primary, that if he wasn't going to run, that he hadn't dropped out sooner. And understandably, it wasn't until that debate where we all realized that he was not up to running for re-election. He himself came to that conclusion. But the Democratic voters that I spoke to in the lead up to the presidential election were begrudgingly supporting, in some cases, Vice President Kamala Harris. They wished that they had had an opportunity to take a look at the other potential candidates who could have been running and to at least had the opportunity to have that conversation within the Democratic Party.
So, Francesca, I'm sorry, I have to jump in for a second. The president, in his statement when he announced he was withdrawing, did not say that he had concluded that he was not up to it. He concluded that in order to give his party the best chance of beating Donald Trump, he was no longer the best candidate to do that because of the divisions within the party about his candidacy. But he didn't say he was not up to it. He basically said that given the divisions that had developed in the party around his candidacy, that he was stepping aside because he felt that the goal of beating Trump was more important. So I think it's important that we are accurate about that because the president at no point thought that he wasn't up to that job or to the campaign, to be honest.
Well, he thought that he was no longer the best candidate to run against former President-elect Donald Trump in the election. But the voters, I'm saying the voters felt that they wished that they had had the opportunity to vote in a primary situation. And there were a number of voters who I spoke to in the election who watched the debate and were disappointed, and they felt that he wasn't up to running the campaign in that election. I take your point about the reasons that he came to the conclusion himself. I'm more drawing attention to the fact that voters were frustrated.
But Molly, I was just going to say, Chuck and Molly, I'm curious because there was a question about whether it was even practical at that point to have a nominating process at all. I mean, you've watched a lot of them. You've watched a lot of them.
That was the problem. It was impractical. It couldn't be done at that late a date. This isn't 1968.
Yeah.
Right? This isn't a case where you're going to be able to have the smoke-filled rooms and all of that
At the
stuff.
convention.
At the convention. And that's just not the world we live in.
Yeah.
It's interesting to me, and we're going to spend a lot of time talking about a lot of micro decisions. And I can go through a whole list of what ifs. What if the Georgia runoffs don't go the way they do? Does Biden govern differently with a Republican Senate, right? That could have been, we could go there. I'll be frank. After going through the Hunter Biden trial and reading all those transcripts, I can't believe he ran the first time. So and I'm going to set that aside. I'm not here to troll or anything. I just, considering that he had 3 children in crisis, 2 children and one daughter-in-law, that was a lot to bring onto your family to make that decision. But I also think that there was a misinterpretation both of 22 and of 20. And part of it on 20 is, and I understand how it happened, 20 was a COVID election. And I think now it's easier to see this now than it was in the moment, which was any Democrat was going to win that election. I do believe that. We might debate this later, but I think we were at a point by the time of him, all the sort of chaotic nature of the White House, I think it wouldn't have mattered what Democrat got through that primary. And then there was this, because of the Georgia runoffs and January 6th, I think there was a mindset in the party and a mindset of this White House that they had a mandate that actually they didn't have, right? And whether it was going as big as they did, the whole FDR comparison business, and all of that. So I do think that we can sit here and live in a world of micro decisions, misinterpreting the midterms for what it was, misinterpreting what the voters were saying in 2020. I don't believe we have voted for a president since Barack Obama. I believe the country's been voting against. The country voted against Hillary Clinton becoming president in 2016. They voted against Donald Trump getting a second term, and they voted against the Biden-Harris administration in 2024. I think we are in a period of this. I think, frankly, it's very similar. I look at this and it's like we're repeating the late 19th century. In fact, if you look at the last, 6 of our last 7 elections have been decided by 5 points or less. In the entire 20th century, we had 5 elections decided by 5 points or less. And now, the last time we had a streak like this, last time we had 2 one-term presidents in a row, and we're now going to have 3 one-term presidents in a row, late 19th century. And if you want to know if history rhymes, go take a look at the late 19th century. We also had a very partisan media in the late 19th century. So there's a log, as much as there are micro decisions, I think if Harris had 30 more days, maybe she wins. Sort of in the same way that Trump won the first time, that she could have had the narrow slice. Another week in Philadelphia, another week in Detroit, another week in Milwaukee might have been the difference. And there was certainly a path. And I think tactically, the campaign deserves credit for, frankly, overperforming based on what we saw in the rest of the country that weren't battleground states. There's clearly, I think you have to give the campaign credit for doing what it did in 100 days. But I also wonder if we're going to end up talking tactically and sort of missing the bigger picture here, which is, frankly, and the Trump people may be doing the same thing, misinterpreting what the voters are saying.
Well, that's the story of American politics for the last 40 years, one could argue.
Fair enough.
Winning, overinterpreting, paying the price, and then rinse and repeat. But Alex, we're talking here about Biden world woes. You guys had a fair amount of woe to deal. I mean, your candidate was, after all, a convicted felon. He had lots of legal problems. They were ongoing. They weren't ended. When the campaign cruised into the primary season, did you worry those were showstoppers? Because the decision seemed to be made to plow ahead irregardless.
Yeah, I mean, we certainly had our fair shares of things that were outside of our control, some that were within our control. Of course, everything from the lawfare at the federal and state levels. dealing with those cases, taking a tremendous amount of time and resources to handle those issues. The assassination attempt, both of them, Project 2025 that we had to account for and answer for, that we had absolutely nothing to do with. The president didn't review it, didn't bless it. There were so many factors that as a campaign, you have to make decisions with limited amounts of information, certainly limited amounts of resources and time. And, the fact of the matter is we had a relentless candidate that who did plow ahead, did have the fortitude to say, I'm going to get this done. I'm going to proceed forward. I'm going to, sometimes the only way out is through. And so he continued to campaign and all the way through the end and just displayed incredible energy and again, fortitude throughout it all.
And Jerry, I want to jump in because I think that the Trump campaign doesn't get enough credit for having run a very smart campaign. Okay, and it was quite different from 2020 and 2016. I think a lot of us who were involved in one of those or both of those will tell you that it was that Susie and Chris, and obviously the candidate always, but that team ran a very smart campaign, a very strategic campaign, really going back to, changing rules in states so that, to increase their, the probability of him getting through these primaries, amassing the delegates, the kind of stuff they never did in 2016 or 2020. Their paid media campaign was far more strategic than it ever was in 2020 or 2016, their outside game. So I think this never gets discussed, but the Trump campaign, I agree the Harris campaign did a very good job, but the Trump campaign actually ran a very good campaign this time, and I think it should just be on the record, so.
Yeah, I agree. But one quick follow-up. But did you find, Alex, that primary voters didn't care about the legal problems, weren't really thinking about them, or actually were incentivized to support Donald Trump because of them?
I don't want to speak for every primary voter, but I do think that the indictments, particularly the Alvin Bragg case in New York, that energized voters, certainly, that caused... That caused many Republican voters to rally around who had effectively been and continued to be the leader of the Republican Party. And so, yeah, I mean, that certainly helped with registering volunteers. It helped with our fundraising. So, that definitely was an inflection point during the primary race.
I would say, anecdotally, having covered the Republican primary, that certainly was the case. I mean, his polls really shot up after that first indictment and never went back down in the primary. And in part it was because the other candidates who were allegedly running against him all rallied around him. And there's a chicken and egg question here, right? It may be the case that, Ron DeSantis and Nikki Haley and all the others felt that they had to agree with this line that he was the victim of a witch hunt and he was being targeted by a weaponized justice system because their voters already believed that. But be that as it may, because in sort of normal politics, it's not usually a good thing when you're criminally indicted, in part because your opponents will make that an argument against your candidacy. But aside from Chris Christie and maybe Asa Hutchinson, none of the other Republican candidates did that. They all took his side, and so they're bolstering his argument that he is being targeted by the legal system, which ends up being reinforced with each successive indictment. And then I think the underrated, this has been discussed a lot as in terms of the primary, but the other underrated aspect of all this was the way that it helped Trump in the general election to neutralize the democracy argument. Yeah. If you look at the exit polls, of the substantial proportion, I'm not recalling the exact numbers, but of the voters who said that they were concerned about the state of American democracy, felt that democracy was in danger, Trump narrowly won those voters because he used the indictments to make this argument that the legal system was weaponized against him. And so when, I think a lot of Democrats would look at the polls and say, look at all these people who are concerned about democracy, we're going to win. But a lot of Republicans were in that number saying that they thought democracy was at stake for a totally different reason than Joe Biden did.
There's one other thing that Trump was brilliant about that was mocked at the time, and that was the decision to announce in late 2022, hurrying up and getting into the race, because it triggered something that ended up being a political gift. It triggered a special counsel, and it triggered a special counsels actually on both Hunter Biden and Trump, right? I mean, this goes back to, wherever you are on this issue, if you think Trump deserved to be investigated on all of those things, you should be angry at Merrick Garland for dragging his feet for 2 years. He took a long time, so that by the time he was coming around to it, he was stuck having to do a special prosecutor because Trump announced his candidacy for president. And the minute he did, it triggered that. And it ended up being, I don't know whether it was strategic or not with Trump, right? He just goes through, but it turned into a strategic play because then you also had DeSantis who got caught off guard. There's, like I said, there's so many what ifs to do. But one of them in the Republican primary that I've always wondered, and I've had this discussion with a lot of my Republican sources, is what if DeSantis had gotten in January, right after he'd had the big win, gets in January. This person, well, I've had plenty of people say to me, 100 House Republicans would have endorsed DeSantis in January. Trump was toxic still in January of 23. There were a lot of Republicans ready to move on, right? But then he delays getting in, for whatever reasons now, because he wanted to use his legislative session to set up what he thought was going to be his sort of policy agenda. So I understand how he was thinking if Donald Trump didn't exist, right? If Ron DeSantis was going to be the front runner, the DeSantis plan of announcing in May made a lot of sense. That was the George W. Bush calendar that goes back in 1999. But that moment, I don't think we fully appreciate. And there's a lot of there's so many sort of butterfly effects here, right? Merrick Garland's decision to not do anything for a year on Trump contributed to this moment that gave Trump this sort of fighter. And by the way, there's a fine line between being a criminal and being a fighter. And Trump used it and became a fighter. And if a lot of the public thinks the system is corrupt, they're not. I've had plenty of Trump voters say to me, yeah, I know who he is. But you know what? He actually understands. They're all corrupt in there, and so give me somebody who's on my side.
So the Republicans running against Trump, of course, didn't make an issue out of the indictments and all the legal issues. But also, I'm curious, this is almost a question for Anita, the Biden campaign didn't really do it either. And of course, I understand they want to make sure that it does not look political, but it also feels a bit like something of a missed opportunity there. And maybe there's just the sense that you can't do anything to really, muddy up Donald Trump any more than he is muddied. Like, people sort of understand who he is. And I think one of the reasons why the criminal trial didn't do a lot of damage is because, he probably did that. Like, that's kind of how people look at it. They're not necessarily surprised.
He's not alone in doing that. They all do that.
Yeah. So, I wonder, just more from the Biden perspective, did you just not even really see that there was an opportunity there to do anything to him? Or is it just simply you wanted to make sure that, for the sort of not playing into his argument that it is somehow political?
Well, this is a president who in 2020, when he was running, it's a great question, because it was certainly a matter of some internal debate. But, he did pledge to restore rule of law, and he believes it, okay? And so there was a strong feeling that if if the president or his campaign started attacking Donald Trump on these legal issues where our administration was actually going after him, that it was certainly like doing paid advertising for Trump at that point. It would have been his message. Look, Joe Biden's attacking me. His Justice Department is attacking me. They're investigating me. So that was one. But two, the president really did not believe that was something that was appropriate for a president to do. That is going to feel very quaint in about 6 months, I can tell you, okay? But he felt very strongly that he'd been elected, kind of bring some normalcy, rule of law, kind of strictures back to this government, and that was not the place he was going to go. But I will say that from my perspective, it would have been a dumb thing for us to do politically. It would have been totally playing into Trump's hands.
Yeah, I'll add on to that. I also was polling for the Biden campaign before the candidate switch. And we did some polling with the Wall Street Journal prior to this, but obviously these, legal woes and things didn't happen just when the charges were brought. And it was so baked in on Trump. People knew about these things. They knew these things were coming. The charges certainly, for some voters, may have legitimized them, but I think in our Wall Street Journal poll, when we were testing different attributes and traits about Donald Trump, 54% of Americans agreed that the term criminal described Donald Trump. So perpetuating and pushing this out was not necessarily additive. And we did some Republican primary oversampling in that about the impact of the charges. And, there was an audience of people who said this has no impact in how I view him, meaning they already like him and this isn't going to make them like him less. And some people did feel more galvanized. And then for general election voters, they really felt like these things were so baked in on him that talking about it more wasn't necessarily bringing more to the conversation about the reasons that these voters may consider not voting for him. And it was much more important to stick to the pieces that impact the everyday person. And while it is very disconcerting that 54% of people would say that term describes someone who many will go on to vote for president, I think it does go to Chuck's point that I think there's going to be a surprising number of voters who believe that term criminal describes a lot of politicians, and that in some ways, certainly he's a higher watermark on this, but that cynicism does, it gives him a little bit of permission, and it ties up his opponents when it comes to these things.
There's so much about Donald Trump that is like that things happen that just simply make people who love him more, and people who hate him more, but doesn't change anybody's mind.
By the way, I think it's funny that we're here at the Dole Institute.
Yeah.
Bob Dole, as frustrated as Democrats sound, talking about how does Donald Trump get away with this? I'm old enough to remember when Bob Dole wondered, how does Bill Clinton get away with this? I mean, it's almost like the same conversations, except it'd be like, voters seem to not like this, but they're okay when Clinton does it. And it is eerie. I've always said the two of them are sort of, you wouldn't have had Trump without Clinton. And and you discuss that all you want, but there's a yin and yang here.
Yeah.
If I can just raise one more counterfactual while we're in the land of hypotheticals before we move on from the primary. The thing that I wonder about is how it would have affected the Republican primary if Biden had decided not to run for re-election in 2022. Because the one way that Trump's opponents did use the criminal indictments was as part of an electability argument. You had Nikki Haley especially saying, look, I'm fine with the guy, but he has all this baggage, he can't win. And as Biden started to drop in the polls over the course of 2023, getting weaker and weaker and more unpopular, that really defanged that argument. And more Republican primary voters were looking at those head-to-heads saying, how can they say Trump can't win? He's beating Biden in the polls already.
Is that 2016 post-election or 2024? Same phenomenon. Late in the primaries in 2016, you had Ted Cruz saying, oh, Trump can't get elected. And the head-to-head showed, oh, yes, he can, because Hillary Clinton's going to be the Democratic nominee. Anybody can beat her.
But I was going to say at the same time, so I actually covered Nikki Haley in the Republican primary. So she was making other arguments, though, too, about the age of both of the candidates. She was drawing a strong contrast between herself and Donald Trump when it came to foreign policy and her stance on Russia's war against Ukraine. I mean, she certainly, was out there making other arguments that drew a contrast. And you talked about when Ron DeSantis got in the race. It wasn't just that he delayed that decision because of the legislative session until May. Recall that the moment where he actually started to lose a lot of steam was when he came out and he said that what was going on in Ukraine was a territorial dispute. That was really a clear moment and where he started to go down in the polling. So had he gotten in the race and made the same exact comment, I guess as Molly would say, in the land of counterfactuals, it's also possible at that point that he would have also started to tank anyway.
Yeah. I want to go back to Alex. Alex, can you tell us, was there any internal debate in the Trump campaign about passing on the primary debates? Whether or not it might backfire?
I don't know, to be honest with you. I know that was something that Chris and Susie were talking with the president about. The president himself, I know, went back and forth on it. Again, considering
He loves a
counterfactuals.
microphone. It's shocking he didn't want to do it.
I know, right? So I genuinely do not know and can't speak exactly to that primary. I do know, at the end of the day, we were taking so much oxygen out of the room during the primary by not being there. Our absence essentially was felt more, and in so many different polls, right? We were polling 10, 15, 20 points ahead, depending on the early state. Why punch down at that level?
It should not have been a difficult decision for them to make. None of the other candidates were putting him in a position where he needed to.
That's true. They did give him a pass on it, essentially, didn't they?
Nobody got close enough to even sniff. I mean, he didn't have to, he was never sweating for a moment. I think Ron DeSantis' candidacy tanked when he started campaigning and just proved that he wasn't very good at this. And I don't mean to be mean. He's not a very charismatic guy, and eventually, once you start campaigning long enough, that's going to become clear. If Donald Trump was in any real danger of losing a primary, he probably would have done a debate. But there was no real primary. Nobody was ever. I don't think that there's any evidence that any sort of counterfactual of how Republicans could have run this primary would have led to a different outcome. He was always going to be the nominee, almost no matter what.
But I do appreciate Chuck saying earlier, though, talking about the November launch, because that really, we received a tremendous amount of criticism for being the first out of the gate immediately after the midterms that didn't go as well as we had expected or had hoped. And meanwhile, you've got Ron DeSantis coming off.
Well, more than that, Trump was being blamed for the midterms not going as well as expected.
Yeah, exactly. And then you had Ron DeSantis coming in with a massive amount of money that he was managed to transfer to a super PAC, and hiring up a ton of talent on the Republican side.
He was getting Elon Musk.
I mean, exactly. So I mean that to be in that position at that time was very, very difficult, particularly when you're talking about small states, Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, Nevada. We did, pull some tricks to put ourselves in a better delegate position there.
Delicately.
But I mean, there was a moment in time, those really the first and second quarter of 2023, where I won't say that we necessarily were afraid of losing, but we did have sky-high expectations vis-a-vis some of the other opponents and certainly DeSantis as well.
So I feel like even though Ron DeSantis delayed his announcement to May and was unimpressive out of the gate, I do feel like Ron DeSantis showed that he did not have what it took to be on a path to the nomination, because Trump also, he announced in November because the announcement was, the date was set before the midterms. He was going to do this right after. I don't know that the date officially was set, but that was the thing.
I'm convinced it was connected to the investigations.
Oh, interesting. Oh, well, so it was presented as we've got this red wave coming and Donald Trump is strong and emboldened and he will ride that wave into an announcement. I mean, that was certainly, I'm not on that side of the aisle, but the way it was characterized. And then that didn't happen. And it was an unenergetic, sort of unceremonious candidate launch. It was not the energy that we're so used to seeing. And everybody was galvanized behind Ron DeSantis, and he had all this money, and he took no punches. Yeah. And he did absolutely nothing to capitalize on that moment. And if anybody has learned anything about Donald Trump, it is that he goes down sometimes and he does not stay down long. And so if he wanted to wait and keep his hands clean, you do not have that killer instinct. You do not have the appetite or the will to go on to beat this guy in a primary. And I feel like when that happened, and nobody, I mean, and it should have been Ron DeSantis to take some real swings at a guy who was down and had very few friends out there because he was blamed for losing the midterms. That was his moment. Delaying his announcement, fine, but you can still be the lead attack dog within the party on Trump. And he completely blew it there, and there was no way he was going to be able to recover from that.
So Alex, let's fast forward to that moment when the president decides he's not going to run. Presumably, you had a path to victory in mind with Joe Biden as the candidate. What was the pathway then, and did it change when the opponent changed?
I mean, the fundamental issues of the race never changed after the switch to Kamala. I mean, it was always, and President Trump was relentlessly focused on the messages of immigration, the border, inflation, and the economy. And so we worked to transfer those failures over to Kamala by defining her as the borders are, by continuing to hammer away at basic pocketbook issues that, again, were not getting better. Obviously, you change your tactics to fit a particular candidate. And certainly some of the math to 270 changed when we looked at some of the states that maybe had been in play when Biden was the nominee or the candidate versus when Harris came in.
Like which ones, for example?
Like Minnesota, Virginia. Our polling looked incredibly bullish when Biden was still the nominee. When they made the switch, there was certainly, and Tony Fabrizio, our pollster, has talked about kind of a bump and an energy that occurred after Harris was the nominee. But obviously that continued to slide downwards over the next weeks and months as we started to really prosecute the case against her campaign.
Okay. Brendan, I'd like to direct a question to you. Early on, Democratic Senate and House candidates appeared to be outperforming President Biden in swing states. Did that indicate the presidential and congressional races were moving on to different tracks?
I certainly think it indicates that the Biden issue was unique to Biden and that it was an age thing and it wasn't necessarily much more than you could draw from that. I mean, at that stage, it's still early in a cycle, and you're incumbent. Thinking about the Senate races in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Ohio, you've got relatively popular incumbents who are going to typically be outperforming their challengers at that point, and those were probably always going to be closing. I can tell you, though, Republicans at the campaign committees certainly weren't looking for a switch. They were very happy to have Joe Biden remain on the ballot, and not because they didn't think that they could do well with Harris, but they just kind of knew where this was headed. And at that moment, I think a lot of Republicans sort of underestimated Harris as a campaigner just based on 2019, and some of that I think did sort of come back up at times. But there was just a lot of uncertainty. Okay, we know that Joe Biden is not in a good path. We're happy to keep it there. Any change, even with a candidate we don't think is bad, or a candidate we don't think is a good candidate, is bad for us. And so they were all, I think, a little shaken by the switch as well. But ultimately, those races were always going to sort of close because it was still a little too early in the cycle.
Can I say, though, it ended up being the case that it was not a Joe Biden phenomenon, and that decoupling persisted, and we actually got a remarkable amount of ticket splitting in the final result when multiple Democratic Senate candidates were able to win in battleground states that Harris lost. And so I think what may have looked like a Biden phenomenon for obvious reasons was actually a Trump phenomenon. He's more popular than other Republicans, and his coattails didn't always transfer because he has an appeal, particularly when it comes to grassroots turnout, that Republican Senate candidates don't necessarily have. And I don't think it's just a function of popular incumbents, because Ruben Gallego was not an incumbent, Alyssa Slotkin was not an incumbent. There were multiple non-incumbent Democratic candidates that were able to win their Senate races very narrowly in states that Kamala Harris lost.
I'm not convinced they're ticket splitters. I think you have what I've been calling shotgun Trump voters. Mm-hmm. They come in, they vote Trump, and they leave. And you see the drop off, and you can see it, and you can see the numbers.
You mean literally? They don't vote for anybody else.
Correct.
Yeah.
They go in. It's interesting. There's some analysis that was just done by Vandil about news deserts and how they voted. Mm-hmm. But there is one of the potential connectors is that if you're in a news desert, you know about Trump, but you may not have even really knew a lot about the other candidates. And a lot of voters, I always say this about voters, they're always smarter than we treat them, meaning if they don't know something about a candidate, they don't want to risk voting for the wrong candidate. So they don't vote in that race. They'll skip that race. And if you look at the numbers, this appears to be more shotgun Trump voters than any sort of vacillating. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but it does appear when you look at the numbers that this is more of a we saw the same thing with Obama. It's a reminder, these presidential coalitions accrue to the person, not the party, which is why they literally come apart as soon as the person leaves, right? Reagan's coalition lasted literally just enough to get George H.W. Bush elected, and that was it, right?
One time.
Barack Obama's coalition, basically, their fumes got Biden elected, arguably, right? And then it's gone down. And I think that this would be the warning sign for Republicans, that these are Trump voters. That doesn't mean they're Republican.
And the other just data point to throw in there, so Trump won by 1.5% roughly. Mm-hmm. At the House level, Republicans won by 3%. Now that's messy because, who's voting in what elections and how districts are, divided up. But it's just interesting that they're actually won by a higher margin at the House level.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting one to dissect because some of it is going to be a function of the way the lines are drawn and just, gerrymandering.
What's competitive.
And but then I think the other piece is, and I think this happened in 2022 and it happened this cycle at the top of the ticket level, which was campaign effect was real in behalf of Democrats, meaning so nationally there was a, I guess in non-battleground states, there was a 6.7 point shift towards Trump from 2020. And in the campaign states where there was active program going on, field, paid media, all of those things, it was 3 points. And I think that arguably you could make the case in some of these competitive House races that campaign effect held off some of the larger Republican swing.
So Molly, you literally rode the transition from candidate Biden to candidate Harris. When that switch happened, and it's worth noting nothing like this has ever happened in modern political history, what steps did the campaign, call it the Biden or the Harris campaign, whichever you want, take in those early days to make this movement happen?
I mean, so I can comment on the specific pieces I was involved with. I can sort of give a cursory. There was a lot of operations on the legal end side, on calling delegates, on making sure that she was on a path to become the nominee to avoid a competitive primary and open process. Those are not conversations I was a part of, but knew was happening. As the pollster, one of the pollsters, a lot of it was, okay, what we know about the vice president is that she has very high name ID, but very little branding. And that is a opportunity and that is a challenge. And so digging in to figure out in a very short window of time, what are the things that voters need to learn about her to connect with her in the most positive way possible? Oftentimes, those are not a list of policy priorities. They're not a list of, sort of her agenda items as much as where did she come from? What has she done before being the vice president? And so we had to go to work very immediately. There was no prior research prior to the candidate switch of a backup plan, and we just, pulled that out. And so we really were doing that in real time in terms of figuring out the ways to best introduce her to voters. Of course, the Trump campaign had a longer lead time. As they have said, they were prepared for a potential like this. They had more sort of ready to go. And so we also knew that they were going to be moving quickly. So the other piece of it was figuring out what are the leading vulnerabilities. Does she have vulnerabilities that are different than the president's, or is this all about inheriting the administration's vulnerabilities? And so what do we need to do to reassure and defend against those attacks? And then the last thing I would say, just from a pure targeting standpoint, is who are the voters we should be talking to? As we've talked about, there was a lack of consolidation among some of President Biden's 2020 supporters, disproportionately younger voters, people of color, people who historically vote for Democrats, were voting for Democrats in Senate or House races. Do they come back? Does their, sort of reluctance extend to the president's vice president? And so figuring out who do we need to be talking to? Do they come back, and watching that happen? And so those were the things we did, in week one.
Can I ask you to talk a little bit more about what those data points were? Like what vulnerabilities did she have in your research, and what unique strengths did she have in that early research?
Yeah, so she started with a strength of being more relatable. I mean, her youth and her energy was very connective to people. They felt like she inherently had a better understanding of what their lives were like, more so than Trump and Biden, just by virtue of being younger and being more connected to a lot of the people that we know we needed to reach. She came across as genuine. She came across as caring. She what our vulnerabilities were what has she done? Does she have experience? They obviously were going hard on she's done a lot and it's all bad. And we needed to figure out, okay, what are the things they need to know about what she's done? And one of the important parts was distancing her from Washington. I mean, one of her biggest vulnerabilities was the things that the administration had done that people weren't happy about, whether it was the border, whether it was just inflation and not doing enough, in their perceptions to address it. And so we did a lot in that early window of the prosecutorial background, what she did both in terms of security and safety, because we knew we were going to face border and crime-related attacks. So we wanted to inoculate on that, talk about what her record actually was, and then talking about the things she had done for regular people. So standing up to the banks, to keep people in their homes during the foreclosure crisis, those sorts of things. And I think that in the beginning, to be quite blunt, and I guess I haven't spoken about this before, there was a lot of, sort of right-wing media, even before the candidate switch, about word salads, rambling answers, not being concise, that was being sort of ginned up as, oh, she's not intelligent, she's not smart, and obviously there's some coded language there. That was more intense in the beginning, I would say. And as she did go front and center, I actually expected that to be more of a sort of secondary plot line from Republicans in the Trump campaign, that they were not just going to say she did these bad things, but also, doesn't have the stuff. And I think that's where she campaigned. And the best way to combat that with voters is to show them that that's not true, not to tell them that that's not true. But I think her strong debate performance, I think there were things she did that really took that off the table, but that was one of the early ones also.
So the shortened time frame absolutely hurt her, and I'm sure we'll have plenty of time to unpack that here. But I just want to go back to something you were talking about the defining her. It didn't just start happen in that 3-month time period. Going back to 2022, her team had already realized that she had a problem here, that people didn't know what she did as vice president, that what they did know about her, even among Democrats, they didn't necessarily like. There was this picture, as you were talking about, that had been painted of her, that she was either incompetent or that she had not done a good job on the border, even though the president had charged her with addressing the root causes of migration, which wasn't the same as being in charge of the southern border, but people were really confused about that. So there was a shakeup on her team in 2022. In which they came in and they really tried to rehabilitate her, address her image problems. They put her on national television and had her do some interviews around that time. They tried to get her more out of Washington, inside of the country, so that she could meet face-to-face with voters. By the time that she became the nominee, or rather Biden dropped out and she knew that she was going to be the likely nominee, they were also already preparing for a 2028 situation where she was going to run most likely at that time. So they had already, at least in the inner circle, begun keeping lists of people that she had met with. Like every person she'd been in a photo line with, that she had met with in her office, that she just met with out in events. And so while there was certainly work that had to be done to reach out to all these constituency groups and introduce her to the nation, there was some work that existed already and lists that they could turn on and activists who she had met with who they could call for support easily early on.
Anita, you wanted to jump in.
I did want to jump in because I think this is an important point. Brendan mentioned that when she got in, there was an expectation that she was the 2019 candidate. She was not. And I think she performed at a very high level. And those of us who had been working with her were not surprised because really, as Francesca said, starting in 2022, and particularly after the Dobbs decision came down, she was given the leadership within the administration to kind of be our point person on those issues, and she did a great job. And she traveled the country, she connected with voters, and anyone who was watching her should not have been surprised at how well she performed when she became the candidate, but most people were not watching her. So I think that she benefited some immediately by, some unreasonably low expectations around how she was going to perform, because she actually came in and performed extremely well, and I would say throughout the campaign.
But there was a difference too, though, once she became the candidate. As someone who covered for
absolutely.
for 5 years, I covered her in her 2019 campaign. I covered her vice presidency. Spent a lot of time watching her. When she came in, I mean, almost the moment that she was the one who was going to be on the ticket, from that first time that she addressed the staff, the campaign staff at the Delaware headquarters, there was this new sense of confidence from her that you heard when she was speaking on behalf of herself and no longer the number two and speaking on behalf of President Biden. And I think you see this with a lot of candidates and vice presidents and vice presidential candidates when you've been the number one and then you have to be the number two and you're not necessarily pushing your own agenda anymore, you're pushing someone else's agenda. And I think from the very beginning, part of the reason it wasn't an issue in the campaign longer is because from the very beginning she came out firm and confident, and then you guys were able to move on from that to other issues.
This is, though, why I question the idea that the shortened time frame was a liability, because Kamala Harris opened up a lead in the polls coming out of the convention, late August, early September, and it was steadily downhill from there. And so this idea that she would have done better if she'd had another 30 days, I think she would have done better if she had 30 fewer days. And it really speaks to the effectiveness of the Trump campaign in prosecuting the argument the way that they did, that the longer she was in there, because she did really defy a lot of people's low expectations when she got in the race, and she did open up a lead in the polls, and the Trump campaign was very nervous at that stage, and they kept hammering away at her, and she did go steadily downward as the weeks went on.
Molly, I'd like to go back to you and ask you to take a few minutes to describe the vice president's pathway to victory as you saw it inside the campaign.
Sure. So Alex is right. I think that, the map was getting fluid in that period after the debate with the president on the ticket. And so I think what we saw immediately is that the core 7 battleground states were very much the battleground states. There was no risk in our minds that the Trump campaign was going to be able to expand the map, goad us into going somewhere else and playing defense. So that was absolutely always the sort of state of play in that path to 270. With a particular sort of priority behind the blue wall. Those were always the most competitive states, on election day and I guess in the final margins. That also proved to be true, that those races, those 3 states in particular, always looked to be the best path, though the Sun Belt never really fully, sort of separated in a way that favored Trump so handily that you could sort of take it off of your map. And I would say that was particularly true of Georgia. Demographically speaking, obviously those states all have different, sort of composites of the electorate. Nevada and Arizona, heavy Latino population. North Carolina, Georgia, heavier African-American population, working class voters in, the sort of blue wall. But generally speaking, what we saw was that while we saw a lot of snapback from the, sort of voters that weren't supporting the president, that had supported him in 20, younger voters, people of color, they were still not performing at 2020 levels. And the bigger piece of this is there are a lot of voters that show up in presidential elections who did not vote in the last presidential election. Those voters were woefully supportive of Donald Trump against the president. It became more muddied who those new voters were going to be in this electorate. Were they going to be the rural working class voters that typically comprised, new voter electorates coming in for Trump, those shotgun Trump voters, or were they going to be more energized by the vice president and a sense of relief that this was not just going to be a rematch? And so we looked at the voters in sort of different categories, just in terms of trying to understand them a little bit more. Targeting the younger voters, especially younger men, across racial lines was a huge priority. But we also felt like we saw what Trump was doing to specifically reach out to them, and we wanted to expand our gender gap with women. We saw that after Dobbs as an opportunity, and we had seen a growing gender gap in even prior to Dobbs, election in favor of Democrats. So could we expand that while also sort of holding the line with younger men? We spent a lot of time targeting younger voters. We also wanted to make sure that the president's unique strength with seniors didn't exist only with him. That was a group that he did very well with in 20. That was a group that had very little erosion even in the rematch in 2024. And so looking at seniors, and she actually performed consistent with seniors as they performed in 2020. But so map-wise, it was those 7 states with particular emphasis on the blue wall, but then it really was those younger voters, the more disaffected ones, less so those that identified as Democrats. I mean, it was the ones who are more cynical, certainly don't identify with either party, aren't necessarily angry Democrats who are withholding support, but instead are much more sort of persuadable, anti-establishment, cynical about government, cynical about how the last few years of their lives had.
Were these all Kennedy voters for a while?
Not, yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
were they sitting in Kennedy before the switch?
before the switch, yes. And that was one thing that, when we say that this race got competitive, it was not that a bunch of Trump voters migrated to supporting the vice president. We went in every state from double digits, sometimes approaching teens, vote share, voting for collectively third party, but disproportionately Kennedy. He had his moment far earlier in the campaign, and it was more fractured. I mean, I think in early 2024, Kennedy himself was at 10-12% in polls. By this point in the summer, it was far lower.
He was none of the above for a lot of these voters.
It was a smattering. It was I'm just not happy.
Right.
And so a lot of that came back, and I think within the span, and I think this is true of the Trump polling because I've talked to their pollster, it went from, I believe, somewhere in the neighborhood of 12% of voters voting for some third-party candidate to 3%, and it became a razor-thin race that remained. I sort of dispute that the race went downhill for her from her early entry point. It really was, she had a bit of a bump, and then it was a dead even race, pretty much, and unchangeably so, with a very small number of undecided voters.
Alex, I have a question too. So some of the other senior staff from the Harris campaign have said recently that they never saw her up in the polling, that she never had any lead in the polling. In y'all's internal polling, did you guys ever see Vice President Harris with a lead?
We saw some numbers that were margin, particularly in the blue wall states, and so that certainly concerned us. Nebraska too was obviously never in play in our polling, but upper blue wall states, there was a concern. I mean, ironically, for as dynamic as this campaign has been and it was. It ended up really where we started and where we had planned all along in terms of our field program, our mechanics as a campaign, really the 7 core battleground states. And we're talking 1, 2, 3 points maximum in some of these states in fighting for every vote in every different demographic. And so that was interesting to see again, as the map expanded with Biden at the top of the ticket, and then it became it kind of settled into again just quite frankly a margin race.
So you're talking about the enduring stability of the electorate, really, here, Alex. And let me raise one question that may bear on that point. On July 13th, something very dramatic happened.
Yeah.
There was an assassination attempt, and the former president, was actually wounded in that. It is hard to imagine a more dramatic event in a campaign cycle than that. And there was certainly an expectation it would change something. But I think as we sit here today, it doesn't seem to have had much impact at all. But maybe I'm wrong. And I'm curious for anybody to answer this, but maybe starting with you, Alex. Did it matter? And then Anita. Well, it mattered, obviously, but did it change anything?
Sure. I mean, I think it solidified an image very, very concretely of Donald Trump as a fighter and as the candidate who will fight for you. Yeah. You can't script that moment, obviously. It hits very close to home for a lot of us. I mean, you certainly can understand. Yeah. And so I think that, at the end of the day, it did harden people and it hardened some of our existing supporters, and they understood in a very tangible way how important this race was.
So this is the first campaign in a long time when there's been relatively little coverage of the paid media in the battleground states. I'll tell you, I left the White House and I was working with Future Forward, which was the primary Democratic super PAC. In our research, as the closing days of the race with a dwindling number of undecided voters, this was something people really came back to as kind of a symbol of strength, but also a symbol of somebody who was a fighter and somebody who was going to stand up. But more importantly, and again, if you look at the images the Trump campaign and their super PACs were using in their advertising during their kind of final closing argument ads, and the last 10 days of the campaign, that image everywhere. It was a powerful image. It was a powerful image for voters. And I think because this happened during the month of hell for the Democratic Party, that people didn't pay as much attention to it, but voters paid attention to it. I also think that, along with the legal things, and Molly talked earlier about how that undercut the democracy argument, I also think this undercut the democracy argument for Democrats a little as well. Don't forget one of the enduring things that happened in 2022 in the closing days of the election was a violent attack on Paul Pelosi, the husband of the Speaker of the House, and this sense of political violence. In this case, the sense of political violence was against Donald Trump. And I think that was a powerful thing for a lot of voters.
Can I introduce one counterfactual? I had a Republican who said to me after the Republican convention that it was a blown Republican convention, that the messaging got, look, nobody knew how the convention was going to react to this. There were a lot of people wondering. I was on a plane with every other journalist that felt like that wasn't in Butler, right? And we had no Wi-Fi in our plane. Plane to Milwaukee, no Wi-Fi. So it wasn't until everybody landed, and I'm on with Kellyanne, Jake Tapper. It was the same, and everybody's like, and it was like complete dead silence, right, as everybody turns on their phones and everything comes through. But it did change the messaging of the convention. Mm-hmm. And I had some Republicans who were working on down ballot races who were like, we may go back and regret that it was, speaking as a Republican, that we didn't use the convention to prosecute the case against the Democrats enough. And it was one of those things where now I think I totally where you are. The images were very powerful, and I think they served him really well. By the way, it did. I don't know whether this caused an effect, but Elon Musk didn't get on board until that day. Whether he was always going to get on board or not, I don't know if we know. But if it truly was the moment he decided, you know what, I'm in, well, he turned out to be a pretty important player in this election in the last 60 days.
Yeah.
I'd like to direct this question to start with to Anita and Molly, but I'd like everybody else who wants to comment to please jump in. Can you talk a little bit about how the President Biden's very strong support of Israel cross-pressured the Democratic coalition and constituency?
I think that we definitely saw protests starting in October of 2023, really until he dropped out. And then I think for a while, Harris was not getting protested. We had an extremely peaceful convention. I don't think he ever felt all that cross-pressured. I think, when it came to a matter of national security for this country, he felt very strongly about what to do. But he also made no secret of his efforts to get Israel to move when it came to getting aid into Gaza, and used, a number of tools, both publicly, but much more important, privately. I'd say more importantly, when it came to October 7th, 2023, it is difficult to describe how much time that started taking out of the president's schedule. I mean, those of us who've, worked in White Houses, you've all covered White Houses, but when you have that kind of event happen and the potential on top of the war in Ukraine, then foreign policy became a very paramount consideration, as it had been since he got there, but even more so. And in particular, the time spent around the war in the Mideast became really the dominant thing for a long time for this president. And so, we were concerned. Obviously, we were concerned politically about what was happening. We did a lot of outreach. I think the campaign people did a lot of outreach because, by and large, we were hearing from people who had supported the president in 2020 who were disappointed, who were very disappointed, particularly in places like Dearborn, who felt like they had been there and that they thought Joe Biden was a certain kind of person. But I'll tell you, he is a president who was going to make decisions based on what he thought was in the best national security interests of this country. So it was a concern. It was I think it was never as big a concern as potentially some people thought, because the number of voters it affected were actually quite small. And even people who disagreed with him were still voting on other issues. So, it was one that I think personally was a very tough one for him. So I'll let Molly talk, though, to the politics.
Yeah, I'll talk to the numbers. I mean, we looked at this closely throughout, both qualitatively, meaning listening to voters who are bringing these topics up to us, and then also measuring these things in polls. And there was, of course, younger voters were much more focused on this issue. They were much more likely to say this was a top issue priority in this country, and an issue that they wanted the president and Congress focused on. It still was, that is relative to older age groups rather than relative to other issues. It still fell relatively low in ranked order behind economic issues. But the other piece is the issue that was most important versus which issue is vote driving. On this issue, typically those things go hand in hand. Your top issue is inflation. You are voting for the person you think is going to do a better job on it. It was not as correlated to vote choice, meaning I'm going to vote for the president or then the vice president versus Trump on this, as much as I think the bigger piece of damage that it did widely to Democrats was less about these far left protesters, or that was reflective of a much larger group of voters, as much as people felt like life had been incredibly chaotic. People felt like they wanted stability back. They voted for the president to bring back that sense of normalcy and stability. And all of a sudden, and this was, incredibly difficult imagery that was heavily, spread on social media, which is where young people get their news. And I think it created a larger sense of instability, that this is a scary world. Economically, this is scary. Globally, this is scary. And there are other things that, abortion, things like that all play into this larger sense. And I think that was a larger narrative challenge in this race. And that is where, not because voters thought necessarily that Trump was going to be better on this issue. Certainly those young voters actively were telling us they did not think that. But he was running a very, sort of paternalistic, I will make it better. I am, going to fix your problems. And I think that sort of contrast offset a very chaotic environment.
Yeah.
By the way, James Carville told me after the election he thought the biggest issue was a sense of disorder, which you've just echoed here. There's been a couple of fleeting references in our conversation to the debate. I want to go straight to that. Because I think it's fair to say the consensus was that Vice President Harris did well in that debate. One is a strange term to use in a debate, but let's say she won the debate. I think there was an expectation in some quarters that would move the needle in a significant way. It maybe did briefly, but didn't really substantially. I'm curious, and this is for the group as a whole, why didn't that matter more than it did?
I'm happy to start.
Go.
So I will say that I think it mattered. I think what we often do, we're doing it in this discussion, we do it in politics, is it mattered if the vote moved, right?
Yeah.
Like that's how we measure, does something matter? Did the vote move? And it is correct that this debate didn't move the vote. The assassination attempt did not move the vote. That doesn't mean it didn't matter. Mm-hmm. And so I would contend that her performance in the debate mattered a lot. And I think in two areas. One, I think that was the moment really where there was no more oxygen for this incompetence claim that they wanted to make. She did not come across incompetent. She did not come across uninformed. And so one of our lines of attack that, we did feel somewhat concerned about, how are we going to push this back, was that. I think the other piece was she came in with, as has been discussed, reasonably low expectations. This is where the expectations are the highest. This is where, if you are ready to say, okay, I don't feel good about her, I'm going to listen to my inner voice that says just support Donald Trump, that would have been the moment. And so I think, in the butterfly effect of she didn't have a good debate performance, we would have potentially seen a major hole to dig out from. But I think just because her vote didn't move, I think it kept the race very competitive at a really crucial time. We also knew at that point that really was one of the final big moments, external moments that we could not create ourselves, where we were going to have a lot of eyeballs. And as voters were getting to know her, it was just really important to not just meet the moment, but exceed it. So I think it mattered, and also it certainly didn't move the vote.
She opened the door for voters who weren't sure about her. She came across as presidential, as prepared, as tough, as strong. And so I think that, I agree with Molly, I think people think, a debate is going to change everything. It's rare, it happens occasionally. But what it did was for particularly voters who did not know her very well, who knew who she was, maybe had a good impression, maybe had a bad impression, it made them feel that she was presidential. And so that was a critical piece as the campaign moved forward for her to build on top of. So even though they didn't necessarily say, I'm going to switch my vote, voters who, at least in our research, who had not been open to her, really had not been open to her, had been kind of like I don't want to vote for Donald Trump, I'll probably end up doing it, were willing to go give her another look. And I think that was important to keeping it close.
Was there not a sense of, dread or disappointment, though, that it didn't move the vote? Because to your point, how many other opportunities do you have? Like, you've made the case, she's given a convention speech that was right down the middle, she had a very impressive debate performance, and it still felt like you just couldn't get there. At that point, was there not a level of if not now, when?
And let's not forget, at the end of the debate, Taylor Swift endorsed her.
Yeah, that's true.
And yeah.
Speaking of,
There was also,
moving vote.
well, I was just to jump in here for a second, on both of the reasons and why maybe the effect was blunted, starting with Trump for a second here. Recall that right before the Republican National Convention, President Biden had the press conference that he had. He also had COVID at the time. The assassination attempt happens. This is all taking place literally in the same exact week. Then you have, right after that, Biden ends up dropping out of the race. And so some of what happens here is that the conversation shifted then to, immediately from the assassination attempt to Biden has dropped. Now Kamala Harris is the candidate. So on that. When it comes to the debate itself, recall that there had been the hurricane that happened immediately after the debate took place as well. And so there were campaign stops that she had planned to make, places like Pennsylvania that she had planned to go back to and do some of the work that they planned to do in the central part of the state. I think there was a swing right after that was supposed to take place that ends up getting pulled down. She doesn't spend as much time in Nevada as well. And so there were this couple weeks where she ended up being at the White House instead. And so it's hard to distill into really just one thing about why all these things happen. But then, at least it seemed to me, that it was hard to get whatever momentum that there had been back. So then there's the shift to the democracy argument towards the end as well. So there's a whole bunch of things that end up happening, but perhaps you felt differently at the time.
I think, I'll go to Brendan's question first. I mean, certainly you always hope that some moment breaks through in a way that you see the numbers move, but that's just not how things work. I mean, I was hopeful but not expectant, I would say, of that. And I think also she was still so newly in the race, and voters are smarter than we want to give them credit for. They are more thoughtful and discerning. The notion that someone who we knew going into this, voters had very little backstory on and very little relationship with, was going to convert someone to a voter and that they would stick there, I think just felt somewhat out of the question, and this was going to have to be a little engine that could sort of case where you win every day. So I wished it, but I didn't expect it. And then in terms of the momentum, I mean, I don't know. I mean, pick a week this cycle, I mean, everything only lasted so long. I don't.
But, and Alex, but the reverse question for you is how much fear was there within the Trump campaign after that debate that, oh my God, maybe there's a turn here?
Well, I think Molly's right, is that debates in general don't typically move numbers like maybe we would think they would. But I do agree with her completely that she did overperform what were maybe unfairly low expectations that have been set, and that allowed her to allowed voters to take another look at her and say hey, this is somebody that we're actually, or I could see myself voting for. And so she obviously won the media narrative. She won kind of the Beltway narrative, and continued to hold steady.
Doesn't she owe Donald Trump a thank you for lowering the expectations? I mean, in some ways,
Yes.
he
Yes.
he alone
100%.
was the single force behind this idea that she wasn't bright.
Yes.
Right? He did it every day.
I completely agree with that.
Yeah.
I will say, I mean, the one thing that didn't get brought up here that I reflect on and felt this way at the time, and it wasn't our campaign, this was, sort of organic things happening. One thing that was nice when she got into the race that we haven't discussed is she did have a social media engagement element where the people we needed to reactivate who are not going to follow traditional news sources or, watch the debate in full, but they will catch moments. She had energy there. Trump had energy there. The president didn't really have energy there. So she was generating online conversations that also felt very good for us and felt new from, sort of the energy we needed to have. A lot of what came out of the debate in terms of, again, I'm thinking about the voters that we cared about, all the voters, but the voters that we really knew we had to connect with every day were the voters who did not watch the debate. The younger voters who were going to see clips and snippets and produce content about it, but not watch the whole thing, and sort of take and latch onto these viral moments that way. That's really the people that we were thinking about. And the viral clip that came out of the debate was they're eating dogs and cats, and that is silly, and that's why it was viral, but I don't think that was helpful to the vice president. It circled back to immigration is a big, scary problem, and maybe it's not entirely factual, maybe it's completely false, but at the bottom of it all is this sense that there is disorder, that there is fear, that there is chaos, and we all, we, like Royal, we laugh about it and it went very viral, but that became the talking point out of the debate for that community of voters who we really needed to reach. All of us here were like, she crushed it, she did great answers on these, held him accountable, all of that, but again, we're talking about this small group of voters that latch on to just a couple of things coming out of it.
Well, and I think the fact that the viral moment out of the debate was a Trump clip is telling, because although she won the debate in terms of skill and in terms of scoring points, the way that she won it was essentially prosecutorial. She baited Trump, and she had telegraphed that this was the strategy, and the Trump people were behind the scenes trying to get him not to take the bait, and he's incapable of that, so he did it over and over and over again. And so she made him look silly, and she got him to go down a lot of rabbit holes that reinforced a lot of the negative perceptions of him. But what she didn't do, and you can't do everything in a debate, and it's possible to nitpick these performances. It was a strong performance on her part, but what she didn't really do in the course of that was fill in the blanks of who she was and take the opportunity to define herself more fully for voters. She was too focused, I think, on taking the fight to Trump, and so she scored a lot of points on him in that regard. But there weren't, to your point, a lot of clips that came out of the debate where she explained herself and gave voters a fuller picture of what exactly it was that she stood for.
It's the Trump superpower, isn't it? The ability to be the subject of every conversation, no matter good or bad. So.
Going into Election Day, the polls showed a dead heat, possibly with some exceptions like the Des Moines Register poll, which is historically a very accurate poll, turned out to be completely wrong. I don't think anybody really thought, at least outside the Trump campaign, that he had a chance to win the popular vote. So were you surprised by the results?
Our polling actually always indicated that he had a good chance of winning the popular vote. I mean, in fact, that was, to me, the biggest because we saw that there was no movement in the battleground states, but he had improved his standing in the blue states. So it seemed inevitable that the winner was going to win the popular vote this time. So certainly, I felt like all the polling I saw, there was I'm not going to, I think our national poll's a little bit better than most, but all the polling seemed to indicate to me that that it was more coin flippy on the popular vote this time than either of the previous. I mean, don't forget, this is the only Trump election that it was close, that the polling showed it close the entire time. In some ways, it's the only Trump election where the polling's been accurate. I mean, the last two both had, Clinton had a 6 to 8 point lead going into election day, if you believe the polling, and Biden had a approximately 5 to 7 point lead, right? So that is not what we ever saw in this election, at least in our polling.
Where do I Venmo you for saying that the polling was very accurate?
No,
this
I'm
cycle?
on a, the only thing that has destroyed the reputation of polling are the polling aggregators. 538 and Real Clear Politics mislead. They don't help you understand the polling. They're off my soapbox. Sorry.
But they
I think those two things have
Venmo's
ruined.
filling up for you.
Yeah, I think they've ruined people's understanding of polling.
But they also had a coin flip race.
Sure.
Our
Okay.
final poll had Trump at points.
Nate Silver got it
Silver's-
right in 2008
2
when
points.
everybody could get it right in 2008.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Our final poll had Trump up by 2. So, okay. But I think the question is more about the blue states. Did people actually think all the whole wall of blue states would go Trump? That was the bigger surprise. I think that's fair to say.
So I'll speak to Pennsylvania first. It was starting to feel like it was not gonna go Kamala Harris's way several weeks before the election. Just looking at going back to the shortened amount of time that she had to do all the things that I know that the campaign wanted to do. One thing that the campaign had tried to do was try to recreate the playbook that had gotten John Fetterman and Josh Shapiro elected in the state of Pennsylvania. And with more time, understandably, that's something that probably could have been recreated in terms of reaching out to the anti-Trump Republican voters that were in the suburban counties, reaching out to more independents, and stuff like that. But in the amount of time that the campaign had, as you were talking about trying to reintroduce her to voters, you had to also introduce her running mate nationally to voters as well, lay out what her platform would be and how that was going to be different than the platform that Joe Biden had, draw the contrast with Donald Trump. There were all these things that the campaign was trying to do. At the same time, not necessarily run on the same coalition that Biden ran on, because he had relied really hard on white working class men, and she was running on women, suburban women. She was trying to get more youth voters out. Obviously, black voters were a huge focus for the campaign. All of the things that they were trying to do, doing that, as you were talking about, and the number of battleground states that they were trying to hit, including North Carolina, which was a state that Biden had lost in the previous election that they were trying to win, brings you to a situation where she was spread really thin in terms of her time, and in Pennsylvania in particular, they had tried to go to the western part of the state in these counties that were around Pittsburgh to try and push down Trump's margins, cut into his voters. The theory wasn't necessarily that you're going to win in those counties, but if they could just do better in those counties and rack up votes across the state. She didn't go to Philadelphia, which is a huge part of the Democratic vote, for several weeks, and this is where the hurricane also comes in, when she didn't travel for a while. She never went to Allentown in Pennsylvania until the very last day of the campaign, even though the Hispanic vote and the fact that that had become majority Hispanic in Allentown was something that the campaign knew was an issue. And that's not to say the campaign didn't know that these were places they should be or things that they should be doing, but it seemed to be just a function of time. And when you saw that happening in Pennsylvania, it was largely, as we talked about Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, there were similar problems playing out across those states.
I got to say, from my side, I mean, President Trump was actually pretty bullish on winning the popular vote, and told staff and I think made a couple public comments that, hey, we could win the popular vote. Now, as staff, you always want to temper expectations, but truly, I mean, he was seen our numbers with certain segments of voters, the coalition that we were trying to build, whether it was traditional union working voters in the upper blue wall states, or Hispanics or black men. Our numbers were so, we were so bullish on those numbers with those segments of voters that, you know, it was bound to translate over to California, to New York, and elsewhere, in New Jersey, and ultimately that's why you saw some of the historic results from traditionally blue states.
The Republicans were also doing well in the early vote, and there was a line from the Democrats that this was just because they were cannibalizing their election day vote. But from what I understand, you know, the Trump campaign had data, and they knew that those were new voters, and that they were getting they were locking down a lot of their vote in advance of election day.
Which is a totally new phenomenon, right? Changed.
And that was a result of a massive effort on the part of the campaign, both to convince the president that early and mail-in voting was something he could encourage. He should encourage his voters
Alex is nodding
to do,
his head and smiling here.
and then also to build the infrastructure to get those people to return their ballots.
Because so many of our voters were distrustful of early voting.
Wonder why.
Where'd they get that idea?
But even, you know, in some states like Florida, Republicans or my home state of Iowa, like we are used to voting early. It's a thing that we've always done. You know, other states, you know, and obviously this is pre some of the changes to the laws after COVID or before COVID, but you know, after COVID, in many cases it's easier to do that. But it's a cultural shift. It's a cultural change that you've got to educate your voters about.
It's sort of funny to me. Florida Republicans invented the early vote.
Yeah.
And it was all because of the snowbirds. Right. It was all because they needed to figure out a way to make sure they didn't lose out on the snowbird vote, because the snowbirds were in Southwest Florida. And so the irony to this is literally the early vote was a weapon that the Republicans used quite well in the first decade of this century. Then the Obama campaign said, okay, we gotta, and it was in Iowa that they first started to figure this out, actually. And then it became a Democratic strength for about 2 cycles. But it is a reminder that each party sort of learns from the other, and it's always the out party that innovates. The incumbent party never innovates as much as they think they are.
Because they just won,
right? No, but it's true. There is some lack of, because you think, well, I won. I don't have to innovate as much as you do when you're the challenger. You know, losing is force of it.
So it occurs to me there are 2 names that haven't even been mentioned here: J.D. Vance and Tim Walz, though somebody referred to him obliquely.
Referred to the running mate.
Yeah, exactly. What difference, if any, did those 2 characters make? Did they bring anybody in, send anybody out, or was it a non-factor? And I'm open to all here.
My observation, I think they made each of the top of the ticket feel better about themselves, and I mean this in a positive. I think Vance was good for Trump's psyche, and I think Walz was good for Harris's psyche. And then sometimes that's all you want from a running mate. But I don't think either one of them, they ended up with the same fave on fave by the end. It's just something like 40 to 40, 38 to 38, something like that. It ended up a non-factor.
Other thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I won't speak in my capacity with the Harris campaign. Just Molly Murphy thinks vice president choices can only hurt you if you do it badly and otherwise do very little for you. I think we spend a lot more time in the lead up to it, gamesmanshiping, from where, to whom, what background, and it's a necessary conversation. You want to be mindful of those things. But I look at that, your best case outcome is by considering all of those different factors, the person's background, their life experience, you know, their home state, all of those things. It is just to, you know, guard against making a mistake and choosing someone who is a bad fit. I think if you choose someone who is a spectacularly bad running mate for you, then voters will knock you down for poor judgment, and then that's a problem for you. But I think if you choose someone who is an appropriate fit and kind of meets, you know, you partner well with and all of that, and I think Vance and Walz more than did that for their running mates, I think the voters don't think very much about it.
Brendan, you actually worked on a vice presidential campaign, so you have to speak up here.
Yeah, I worked for Paul Ryan when he was running for VP, and we lost Wisconsin, so it tells you how much good that does for you.
But you carried his district.
Yeah, no, I guess it depends, like, what did you want your VP to be doing? I don't know if this is how the campaign meant for Tim Walz to be used, but it was certainly positioned in the media that, like, he was their way to reach men. And if that's really what was going on, it may not be. I don't know that he was really the right guy to do that. He seemed like a sort of Democrat's imagination of what a red state guy would like going.
Brendan, I'm glad you said it.
Like the sort of Elmer Fudd impression, going hunting and everything. You know, I don't know that really.
Look at my plaid shirts.
Right. It felt like he was.
I've been to Cabela's.
So I don't know Tim Walz, but I was in the House when he was serving, and when he was presented as like the authentic, real man, I sort of remember him as a bit of a try-hard in the House, like always having the line, always having the shtick. So it never really resonated with me. That doesn't mean it wouldn't resonate with other people. So a long way of saying I'm not sure that he really added anything, and if their plan was we're going to pick him because he's going to help us do this, then I don't think that was really successful. But to Molly's point, I don't know that it really matters, so maybe that's not what they were doing, but I don't know that he added.
Can I just make one counterfactual?
Yeah.
And that is, because for me, I think the only VP pick that truly had an impact was Joe Lieberman, and how it allowed Al Gore at a moment that he needed to separate himself, and it worked. To this day, I think the race.
Well, it worked up to a point.
Well, I think it worked. I mean, meaning I don't know if Gore gets there without sort of changing the conversation there a little bit. And what did Lieberman do? It allowed Gore to separate from Clinton. And she could have found a VP pick that maybe tried that more. I don't know who exactly that could have been.
Well, you know who it is, the governor of Pennsylvania.
Well, I don't know if he was an anti-Biden pick, though. I don't think that would have meant the separation from Biden.
But as a tactical pick, that's the second. Yeah. That's the Monday morning.
But that would be the only thing, and even that, I still think at the end of the day, it means about 10,000 votes.
So in terms of the what if she had picked Josh Shapiro, I wrote a whole entire story about this. What if she had picked Josh Shapiro? I mean, yeah, there was the idea that maybe that would have helped you by a point and a half in Pennsylvania. Then maybe she would have won Pennsylvania. I mean, if she had won Pennsylvania, she still would have lost the election. So would it really have mattered in the end? But the reason that she went with Tim Walz was because, according to my sources, was that she just had better chemistry with him. And it wasn't a question of at the time, like, do I think that Tim Walz is necessarily going to somehow win me this election? It was, if I win the election, who do I want as my right-hand person, who I want serving with me, shoring me up for when I run for re-election? Who do I want to spend the next 4 and potentially 8 years with? And when you looked at someone like Josh Shapiro, who is seen as very ambitious, he is seen as someone who has his own presidential ambitions, there was a concern about some people that he would either be more interested in his own ambitions and setting himself up in that way. There was also even a concern from folks that are supportive of him that it wouldn't be in his interest to be on the ticket, because what if what had ended up happening the way it ended up happening is that then Harris loses, and then he has to own that before he ever even had a chance to run his own campaign and define himself and be tied to that. So I guess as we're back in the land of counterfactuals here, there's so many that you can run in that situation. But I do think you make a really good point about the Wisconsin argument.
Yeah. So I've been involved in 2 vice presidential search processes, and people don't bring states. John Edwards didn't bring North Carolina. Lloyd Benson didn't bring Texas. Paul Ryan didn't bring Wisconsin. So this idea that somehow there's this magical pick that's going to bring a state, and I do not believe Josh Shapiro would have brought Pennsylvania. So and Molly is like agreeing with me. So yes. That means there's data. Yes. But by the way, I'm a huge fan of his. But vice presidents are not what you vote on. I would disagree with Chuck a little, though. I think the worst vice presidential choice and the most consequential was in 2008 when John McCain picked Sarah Palin.
Oh, yeah.
Totally undercut his brand, right? His brand totally undercut his claim.
I will debate you on that. I
Okay,
actually
will
think,
you debate me on that?
I will say this. I think, though, she kept, you guys would have won a bigger landslide in 08 without her. She kept Georgia in play. She kept a few of these states that were I take your point that it undercut the John McCain brand, hard stop. She kept evangelicals from leaving the party. So there's anyway,
But
what
I
I'm
think
saying is
but
that
I
I
think
take your point, but I think she actually weirdly helped McCain in some parts of the electorate.
Yeah, I
That's-
remember being at those rallies in the fall of 2008 where John McCain could not fill a room,
But
and
she
she was
could.
getting 20,000 people.
That's right. But I would also say that I think she accelerated what is now, what has been happening, which was college-educated voters leaving the Republican Party. And if you look at 2008, you'll see a huge bump up in that number.
I think they
has
take that
continued.
trade.
Yeah.
I would
Turns
also.
out they've taken that trade.
They have taken that trade, for
I
now.
mean, if we also take it like, sort of like the impact on a race, I think it did mess with his brand. I think it made people question his judgment. I also think she constantly threw that campaign off message. And so I also think day in and day out, they were responding to things she was doing. And so they were then having to defend or deflect or all of that. And I think that anytime your campaign is not on your message and driving your, which they had a hard time doing because of Obama.
But
So
were
I
they
don't
winning
think-
that election under any circumstance? I mean, there's,
Yes,
right,
yes,
you know what I
for
mean?
sure,
So
for
we don't
sure.
know, right? And
We don't know.
Yeah,
We
in
don't.
fairness, we don't
Yeah.
know.
Before we go too far down the 2008 rabbit hole, I mean, the person whose vice presidential choice made the most difference in this race obviously was Joe Biden. But
Yeah.
I do think.
Actually, do we go back to Barack Obama?
Yeah.
Well, anyway, sorry.
Fair enough.
The blame pie goes back deep in my brain.
But there was this conventional wisdom after Trump picked J.D. Vance that this was a terrible idea because it was just doubling down on his base.
Wasn't it conventional wisdom? It was Kellyanne Conway screaming at the top of her lungs that J.D. Vance is a bad pick.
That might have had something to do with it. But this idea that, by doubling down on this sort of, populist nationalist ideology that was already sort of in his corner, that this was a mistake because he was just reinforcing a group that was already with him. But I think in hindsight, that was intentional. If you look at the whole of the Republican convention, right, this very hardcore sort of masculinist Hulk Hogan ripping off his shirt, and then all the bro podcasts that Trump went on. It was an intentional strategy on the Trump campaign's part to double down on this base because their theory of the electorate was that there were more of those disaffected voters, particularly among younger men, that they could go out and get in the battleground states that they could use to reshape the electorate. And so they didn't see that as a negative, even when a lot of us did. And then I think the vice presidential debate also mattered, because I think that was a disaster for Tim Walz in a way that really undercut both Kamala Harris's judgment and also the sort of competency argument, the idea that she was ready to be president and to go into the White House because he did not look ready. And then on the other side, I was perplexed by the fact that they kept him in a box. He didn't do any, he got on the ticket by going on MSNBC and being likable, and that's why she picked him, and then they didn't let him do any more interviews. And so I think he was likable in a lot of ways, but he never got a chance to show that, and I don't know, maybe you can speak to whether they were afraid he'd overshadow her or that it was just part of a general media strategy that was very cautious and locked down. But they didn't give him an opportunity to go out and be an asset to the campaign. And then the final thing I'll say about Josh Shapiro is I think the potential upside of a Shapiro pick was not only that he was popular in Pennsylvania, but that it would have been an overt punch in the face of the far left. And that was something she was unwilling or unable to do over the course of the campaign. And had she been able to do that, it might have made her better able to appeal to the center of the electorate in a way that she wasn't able to do.
They did end up sending Tim Walz on Fox News Sunday to go speak to Republicans towards the end, by the way. Yeah, really one. I think maybe twice. Didn't they end up doing it?
When I was working for Paul Ryan, we would do 4 to 8 interviews a day.
And Vance was doing that.
That was the job, and that's what Tim Vance was doing. It was just bizarre that he didn't do much of anything.
Okay, it's been a great first session, and we're looking forward to our second session.